Hey guys! So today we're talking about stories, particularly the stories that we tell ourselves about others and about who they are. Now, I don't know about you, but I think in any great story, you need some great characters. And so, speaking of characters, I would fancy myself a little bit of a people watcher. Like I'm just fascinated by people. I love learning about what makes a person tick and about why they make the choices that they make. I think that's why I love crime shows because I'm just intrigued by why a person makes those choices, right? Now, I don't think I'm a creeper. Most of my people watching happens in like sort of naturally, like when I'm waiting somewhere and just kind of taking in the lay of the land, right? Like, like at the DMV or like the dentist's office or like the waiting room for the oil change place. And it's amazing how when we're doing our people watching, it's amazing how much we fill in the gaps about who a person is with very little information, right? Like, for example, when I was teaching at the beginning of every school year, we would have these big district meetings. And I would sit there in this giant auditorium and I would do my people watching thing. And I would guess what grade level every teacher taught. Sometimes I would do that out loud, right? But this isn't actually that hard to do, right? Like you would see someone that, has a little pep in their step and they're sweet. You can just tell they're sweet and they're real cheery and they're carrying a bag that has a beautiful monogram on it and they're wearing a real cute outfit. And I would look at her and I'd be like, "You are for sure an elementary school teacher," right? And then you'd see somebody else in the same meeting who is carrying a notepad, no computer, no book bag, and the color palette of their whole wardrobe is like neutrals. It's like browns and grays, and they're not really paying attention. They're just kind of giving off that vibe of like, I'm just here because I have to be, and they're doodling, and they're like kind of on their own program. And I would think, that is for sure a high school teacher, probably a high school history teacher, because there's a type, right? Last, you've got middle school teachers. And in typical middle school fashion, they're a little bit of both, right? They're kind of peppy, but they also got a little bit of rebel in them of like, I'm doing my own thing, right? Those are middle school teachers. Middle school teachers are also just kind of weird, and I'll own that, right? Like you can spot one because you're like, that person's weird. They're probably a middle school teacher. Here's the thing, as I'm saying this, I'm right. I am. But that's the problem, right? We see somebody and we tend to fill in all of the gaps about who we think they are, right? We take those bits of information and we're like, I got you figured out. I know your story. Just think about the assumptions that you make about groups of people that you know, right? Now, if you're like, I don't do that. To give yourself a little clarity on assumptions you might be making, pay attention to the very first thing that pops into your mind as I ask you to complete these sentences, right? Like you don't have to say it out loud. Just think about the first thing that comes in your mind, okay? People that are always on TikTok are AP students, are cheerleaders, are always the people that are really into band are people who vape are kids whose parents buy them new cars are. So even though those are stereotypes that we typically wouldn't say aloud, we all tend to fill in the blanks about other people. As human beings, we really can't help it. We form an initial impression of someone within 1/10 of a second of meeting them. So that's unavoidable, right? But where we tend to miss the mark is when we think that when we think of these judgments as facts, as certainties, and we fail to realize that those judgments are pretty limiting because they really are just initial impressions. And we can sometimes set those impressions in stone and we feel like we've got that person figured out. We feel like that tells us what we can expect from them now and also that we have a pretty good picture of where they're going in the future. And so we're taking that information that we have in the present and we're projecting it to write a whole story about a person for the future. So when we form these initial impressions, these snap judgments, our brain is pulling information from previous experiences. If we've had an experience with someone that we group as being like them, our brains refer back to what they did or said to us. And our brain generalizes and applies that information to that person. This works both positively and negatively. Our brain also instinctively shapes some of our impressions of other people out of our own insecurities. So if we feel threatened by their success or their position or their appearance, our brains will instinctively protect us. Unfortunately, this looks like, practically speaking, what this looks like, practically speaking, is that we fill in the blanks by assuming the worst about them. So our limited experiences and our insecurities cause us to fill in these blanks and convince ourselves that we know way more about somebody than we actually do. That we tend to think that we have already got them figured out and we've got figured out who they're going to be in the future. And so we make decisions about whether or not we want to associate with that person or how close we want to get to that person based on saying, well, this is who they are now, so this is the way they're going to be in the future. The ironic part of that is that we hate it when someone does this to us. We get incredibly frustrated when we feel like somebody has formed a whole opinion on who we are based on very little information. But if these impressions are formed instinctively, how are we supposed to resist the temptation to do the same thing to other people if it's really a matter of instinct? So to try to get some insight into how we can approach this, we're going to take a look at a moment from Jesus's life to learn about how to navigate this. So Jesus, where we find him today, is in the middle of a tense encounter with some religious leaders in Israel at the time. And these teachers of the law and Pharisees were a really big deal in religious circles. They were perceived as being pretty self-righteous. So when Jesus comes around and he starts spending time with people that the religious leaders thought of as sinners or people that weren't as close to God as they were, things got really tense because that didn't fit with how they thought of God. They actually started trying to catch Jesus off guard with questions that they hoped they could kind of trick him into proving that he was a phony. They wanted him to slip up and to answer something in a way that took away his credibility and made him look bad. And so during one of these encounters, after some people had gathered together to listen to Jesus in the temple, the religious leaders have just caught a woman in the act of adultery, meaning she's having sex with someone that she is not married to. So these religious leaders drag her in front of Jesus to see how he's going to handle the punishment. And so I want you to look at how he responds. This is in John chapter 8 if you want to follow along. It says, as he was speaking, the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Teacher, they said to Jesus, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her. What do you say? They were trying to trap him into saying something that they could use against him. So that's the end of John chapter 8, verses 3 through 6. So what they're doing here is they're testing Jesus to see if he's going to contradict the law. The law demanded that people respond to this sort of behavior by literally throwing rocks at this woman until she died. And so the religious leaders want to make Jesus choose in front of a crowd of people. Is he going to overlook this woman's obvious sin and ignore the law of Moses, which would take away Jesus's credibility as a teacher and anger the religious leaders? Or is he going to allow her to be stoned, causing the crowd to turn on him? And so this is a trap. The leaders knew it was a trap. In fact, that was the whole point. And so then look at how Jesus responds when they try to trap him. It says, but Jesus stooped down and wrote in the dust with his finger. They kept demanding an answer. So he stood up again and said, all right, but let the one who has never sinned throw the first stone. Then he stooped down again and wrote in the dust. When the accusers heard this, they slipped away one by one, beginning with the oldest, until only Jesus was left in the middle of the crowd with the woman. Then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't even one of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. Basically, Jesus is saying to the religious leaders, you're real quick to point out what everyone else has gotten wrong. But what about you? Have you ever gotten it wrong? Then one by one, those leaders realize that their plan to trap Jesus has backfired. Jesus kindly and lovingly releases the woman who is literally afraid for her life in this moment because she would have known that the consequence is to be stoned. And he tells her to go in freedom and live her life differently. What's interesting to note here is that everyone here is guilty of something except for Jesus, the religious leaders and the woman. And Jesus has a message not just for the woman, but for both of them, that what is possible for your future isn't determined by your past. Not if you're a Pharisee, and not if you're this woman who's been caught in adultery. Both are guilty, and both are free to go, and both are told to leave different than how you arrived, to live different than how you arrived. Jesus challenged the woman by saying, "Go and sin no more," because no matter her reputation, he believed change was possible for her. He didn't make a snap judgment and let that be the story of who she was going to be in the future. You see, the Pharisees did what we do so often. They see this woman, she's caught in the act of sin, and they instantly write her story into the future. I know what you are. I know what you're all about. You're trash. You're a homewrecker. And we feel like we've got the whole story. After all, she was caught in the act. How often do we feel like we know what somebody's all about and we know what their story's going to be in the future, and we feel justified in that because we're like, I caught you in the act? But Jesus reminds us that this one moment, this one sin doesn't define her. This one choice doesn't write the story of her entire future. He didn't write a story about who she was because of what she had been caught doing. He didn't fill in the blank for her, even though, unlike us, he knew everything about her. But perhaps that's the point. He, in knowing everything about her, he's able to see her as a whole person. He's able to see her beyond this one choice or this one moment. Jesus sees that, yes, she is making a bad decision. She is, in fact, committing a sin. But he doesn't let that define her. It doesn't define who she is, the fullness or the entirety of who she is as a woman. It's not summarized in one bad choice. She is a full human being. She's a human being with interests, with loved ones, with a family, with a job, with things that she's afraid of, with things that she hopes for, things she believes in, things she doesn't believe in, things that make her laugh. She is a full human being. And her story isn't written by one bad choice. Jesus proved that we are all more than just assumptions and judgments that other people make of us. Those are based on very limited information, those assumptions and judgments. Each of us is worthy of being known as a full, whole person. Each of us is worthy of the benefit of the doubt, of assuming the best, assuming good intentions when we don't have all the information. And we can extend that same grace and that same love to others. You see, first impressions are unavoidable, but there is a gap between that first impression and really knowing somebody. And so what we put in that gap of not knowing, that is our choice. When we don't have all the information, we're tempted to make a bunch of assumptions and put a bunch of judgments in that gap. But what if we put love in that gap? What if we put grace in that gap? What does that look like? It looks like assuming the best of others and reminding ourselves consistently that we don't have all the information. And that when we don't have the information, we need to let love fill in the gap. When we fill in the gap with judgment, we are only seeing part of a person, their actions, whatever they did wrong or something we don't like. We're taking that limited information and we're using it to write the whole story of who they could be based on that. But when we fill in the gap with love, we are seeing others as human beings, more than what they have or haven't done, but as full human beings that are complex and as human beings whose story is constantly evolving. This requires us to become more aware of how we fill in the gaps with others. Think about your own life and the times that you have felt underestimated or judged. You want to be seen and treated as a full, complete human being, not judged off of limited information. And so you want to offer that to other people. You want to assume the best of them and assume the best of their potential. In fact, this is a good time for us to reflect and to look back and think, is there someone that I have wrongly assumed things about? Is there somebody that I have a really strong opinion of that I've in fact never talked to? Who's someone you think of now that you feel like you've got all figured out, but as you force yourself to dig a little deeper, you realize you actually don't really know that person, and that you filled in a lot of not knowing with judgment. You've written a lot of their story based on limited information. Think about how your view of that person could shift if you first acknowledged that you don't have all the information, and then you made a choice to put love and compassion in the gap between your first impression and actually knowing them. What if we choose to put love in the gap? When we choose to follow Jesus' example and take these steps, we're choosing to let love fill in the gap. Instead of our quick or shallow assumptions and judgments about who they are and what they could become. And so when we do this, we will be people that are known for loving others. Because when we don't know, we assume love. We put grace, we put love and compassion in the gap. Just like Jesus was, and just like Jesus intended for his people to do.